Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I speak with Eric Purdue, the translator of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, the first new translation in over 350 years. Eric discusses the life of Agrippa, the historical context of Agrippa's work, the meaning of occult philosophy and its relation to magic. Eric also explains why a new translation of the 3 books was needed, how he tracked down nearly all of Agrippa's sources, and the relevance of reading Agrippa now, especially in light of the current magical resurgence. Eric Purdue has studied metaphysics and the occult and has practiced magic and astrology for more than 30 years. His particular focus is on practical folk and astrological magic, and he is an active Santero Olorisha in the African-Cuban tradition of Lukumi. His writings on traditional astrology and talismanic magic have appeared in several publications, including The Celestial Art, Essays on Astrological Magic, and the inaugural edition of The Ascendant, the journal of the Association for Young Astrologers. Appearing on podcast and a featured speaker at several conferences on mystical arts, including the 2015 Esoteric Book Conference and the 2017 VGS. He has been a notable voice on the subject of medieval astrology, traditional magical systems, and the legacy of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. His new translation of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy was more than 10 years in the making. Eric, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, well, thank you for being here and thank you for your time. And congratulations on the publication of your new translation of Agrippa. My understanding is that this is the first new translation in over 350 years.
1651.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, and it took you over 10 years. I think you mentioned before hitting record that it was more like 11.
It was 11,
yeah. So it was definitely a labor of love.
Right? It was an obsession.
Okay. Yeah.
For sure.
Well, I want to know where the obsession came from. And I also wanted to ask you your interest, where did your interest in Agrippa come from? But I think first, before even getting to that, is I'm sure that many of my listeners or viewers on YouTube are going to be familiar with Agrippa. But I also know that I have kind of a more general audience. So I thought the best place to begin is to ask you to give a brief introduction to Agrippa and maybe the 3 books of occult philosophy in general. And it doesn't have to be horribly brief. You run with it.
So Agrippa his name is Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. He was born in Germany, I believe in the 1480s. I don't have the dates in front of me. And born to a relatively noble family. From what I understand, his father was, while it was a noble family, they didn't have a lot of money. So, but Agrippa basically, he did the normal, track, went to school early. There were stories about him learning astrology from his father, although to what degree that is not really clear. Agrippa really doesn't really seem to discuss astrology in the way that we're used to it today. He doesn't talk about birth charts and things like that. But he studied medicine, philosophy. His focus was on, in fact, he lectured on the works of Johannes Reuchlin, who is a German Christian Kabbalist. And he, his life's a little bit complicated. So he basically, I guess in a small nutshell, he went through varying periods of practicing medicine. He was a secret agent for a short time. He worked under, different nobles, and along the way he wrote. And a lot of his writings weren't published until, I would say, the 10 years before his death. He got permission to publish a large swath of works that he wrote, and those just started coming out. 3 books was the last one that he came out with. With 3 books in particular, So, I guess the story that I don't know if you're going to ask us later on, but one of the famous stories about him is that when he was young, in his, I would say, beginning in his late teens, he was part of a kind of a loose secret society of, I don't want to call them occultists, but enthusiasts of the esoterica or the esoteric. And, it was pretty controlled. And some of the letters, Agrippa seemed that he was actually the person vetting a lot of the people who they allowed. But it was more of a mutual aid society, I would say. And they wrote letters back and forth. They traded notes, probably traded texts. And when Agrippa was in his, I think he was 23, if I'm not mistaken, he wrote the first draft of 3 books of occult philosophy. It was much smaller. And he sent that text to the abbot Trithemius, who he had spent a few months with previously, and basically, to get approval, for this book. And the abbot sent his approval back, gave him some advice. That letter is in 3 books of occult philosophy in all editions. And time passed. Apparently, that manuscript leaked out, and Agrippa, around the time that he received his imperial privilege to write the book, to publish his books, he decided to take that and expand it and officially publish it. And in his own words, he said that he wanted whatever errors to be his own. He didn't want to answer to other people, basically, for their their versions of what he said. So the final edition of Agrippa, if I were to take a guess, maybe a third larger than the original, and it's never gone out of print since it was published. We could go a lot deeper, I guess, into details. You probably have some questions about that, but in a nutshell, that's Agrippa and 3 books.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I have some background in that period of time in the esoteric traditions. I've got the, translation of Agrippa, the common one edited by Tyson. And I'll be honest, I haven't gone all the way through it.
You have.
Well, it's always been on my list, but, and I'll be honest, I've had access to the galleys for your translation, and now I just want to wait. I'm like, I'm not even going to bother with that previous edition, because I do feel like your translation, it just reads so much better. My understanding is that the translation that has been in existence, it's usually referred to the JF translation. And I think it's like associated with James Freak. So just call it
the controversy.
Yeah.
The Freak translation sounds great, by the way. But
yeah. I like that.
So James Freak and John French. Those are the 2 names.
Right. Yeah.
I think that I might have this mixed up, but I believe Joseph Peterson said it was John French, he believes, because he was an alchemist. I think it was Joseph Peterson, if I'm wrong, forgive me. I don't want to get into that controversy. Right. So it's JF.
Yeah. Well, I just figured that we would just refer to the Freak translation if we ever had to. But it was just a couple of weeks ago. I was lecturing, and all my lectures right now are on Zoom, because we're still in pandemic fun times. But I was covering a Near Eastern religion class. I always include a segment on the Hermeticism and sort of the esoteric and alchemy, because I think it's important. It's part of our intellectual history and tradition, and that students often don't get access to.
Right.
And I mentioned that it was also there was this connection to the magical traditions. And I want to ask you about this, but I happen to have, you can't see, but I'm surrounded by stacks of books here. And I happen to have this old translation of Agrippa. And so I was able to open up and kind of read that, how he was defining magic. And I had just like the day before, or even maybe earlier that day, read your translation, and I was able to do this kind of comparison. I'm like, oh, this new translation is so welcome. It's so much nicer. Yeah, absolutely.
We can't fault JF for that, though.
I mean, no. Yeah, it's 17th century English, right?
It's a little rough for some people.
Yeah, it certainly was. And my understanding is that the JF translation, there were some errors in it too. Yeah, that you were able,
especially with astrology.
Okay,
and it's actually I don't understand why, because for several reasons. Because A, if he was the alchemist, he should have known the astrology. And if he and also the astrology that Agrippa talks about was just the normal astrology of the time, which is not the astrology of today. So that was one of the issues that Tyson had, not really his fault, but is that the terminology that Agrippa uses is not the same terminology we use today. And it's concepts that are not in modern astrology at all. And so I can forgive Tyson for not knowing that, because the traditional revival hadn't really taken root yet. It barely started when it was published. So he was trying to go through Ptolemy, and Ptolemy isn't really the best source either. So very common terms. The one I always point out is the term profection, which is profection. And both JF and Tyson interpret that as perfection. And so the problem here is a profection is a traditional astrological predictive tool, one of the simplest ones. Basically, a sign represents a year. So your ascendant is going to be the year you were born, and then your first birthday will be the second sign, and you just keep going around in 12-year cycles. Perfection means nothing by itself. So Tyson wrote a footnote saying, okay, well, I think that this is the, full moon or new moon. And, it becomes a mess. So if you're trying to learn or trying to understand what Agrippa is actually saying, when you have these kind of faulty footnotes and sometimes bad translations, it just becomes a complete mess.
I wanted to ask about the importance of Agrippa, because I think that it is the foundation for so much in terms of, I guess what we would call esoteric knowledge and traditions that we get, not just from astrology, but like herbalism and incense. And it was the foundation for the magical lodges in Britain, I think,
right,
like the Golden Dawn. And one of the questions I have is, with these translation errors, how is that going to affect how these systems have been understood for the past couple hundred years?
I think that if you're talking about the way that something like the Golden Dawn is structured, I don't think it really matters.
Okay.
But I do think it matters when you're talking about correspondences, or if you're trying to recreate, particularly incense recipes. Doesn't make sense. I mean, one of my favorite examples is I think it's the incense for Regulus. Is it Regulus? No, it's not Regulus. It's one of the lunar mansions. But one of the ingredients is, in Latin, is curabe, which is it's not a common term. I had to really look it up. But JF says it's jet. And I'm no stranger to strange incense, ingredients, but jet doesn't burn. And it's not unheard of to put stones in an incense blend. I mean, it's not very popular today, but it did used to happen sometimes, because it doesn't have to burn for it to have a magical property to it. But as almost the sole ingredient. It's very strange because you're not going to put a stone on top of a charcoal and expect anything to happen. So I did a lot of searching until I eventually figured out that it was a local term from Spain and part of France for amber. So cases like that, if you're trying to do a lunar mansion incense recipe and you're trying to use jet, versus amber, that's a pretty big difference. But I think when it comes to the lodge systems, they were, especially Golden Dawn, they were trying to pull in everything,
right?
And with faulty sources in a lot of cases,
right?
And but I think when it comes to the herbalism, yes, it does make a difference. Astrological correspondences definitely makes a difference. The sigils, there are some errors there. That makes a difference, I think. The sigils are used constantly, to this day.
Right.
So,
do you think that because I know that you wrote that there were, or identified that there were even errors in the graphics. So I'm assuming that that's where the sigils come in.
Right.
Did the incorrect sigils still work?
It's up to you. I'm not going to answer that one. Well, I think the problem with it is, I guess you could, if you want to have a circular talisman, you can just turn it around. Okay. But I think the issue is that if you're trying to figure out its placement in a magical square, it won't work. Okay. Because it's not going to line up correctly.
Right.
There's one section, it's in book 1 on the letters of the planets. That one's kind of a mess. In every edition of Agrippa, it's a little different. And in the source that Agrippa got it from, it's also different. I just had to make a footnote and say, they're all different. I'm just going to pick a version and go with it.
Yeah, sure.
On Google Books, you can find the original.
Yeah. I think that maybe before moving on, we should kind of address the title of occult philosophy and its connection to magic, because it seems to me that Agrippa, the way that magic is understood is probably rather different than what a person who is not familiar with magical traditions, how they would think of magic. So
it could be even different from them.
Yeah, for sure. So what is occult philosophy for Agrippa, and what is magic?
Well, occult philosophy is multi-layered. The meaning is multi-layered. So if you ask most people what occult means, they're going to say it's secret. It is secret. That's the main translation of it. But what that translation doesn't really convey is the complexity of the term hidden, because hidden, a lot of times people say that it simply means things that were kept from the outside world. So you had an occult book, you had to hide it, or if you knew something, you had to be careful who you said that to or who you divulged that information to. And that's true. That is absolutely true. But what Agrippa also means is the hidden effects of how things work. So the other name for this, which has fallen into disuse today, is natural philosophy. And that forms, I would say, a pretty big chunk of what he means as occult philosophy. Not all of it, because he is talking about magic. It's important to realize that the time that Agrippa lived, the existence of magic and astrology were not remotely questioned. Even if you didn't believe in it, or even if you thought that it was evil, it wasn't questioned. A good example is astrology with the church. During many, not entirely, but many periods of Christian history, doing a natal chart might be considered to be bad, but you could use it for medical astrology, and that was entirely, in fact, it was normal. So the astrology wasn't questioned; its utility was questioned. Same thing with magic, and that was one of the main, I think, focuses of that Agrippa was trying to touch on is that magic is not inherently evil. It's something that's talked about in the Bible. It's something that the church fathers talked about, maybe even did in some cases. And so he wanted to sort of, kind of put that in the forefront, that it isn't necessarily just some secret little thing that some old woman in a shack is doing, proverbially speaking. But from today, we grow up in a scientific, materialistic worldview, and no matter how much you believe in magic or astrology, it's a major hurdle that you have to get over, because magic and astrology are not supposed to work. And even when you think that it's working, there's a little thing in the back of your mind that kind of questions what you're seeing. Is there some scientific explanation for it, or am I hallucinating, or something like that? And I don't think that was necessarily as much of a problem back then. And it's taken me all this time to even approach thinking that way. It's so difficult to get over. It's still a little nagging thing in the back of my mind. And I think that from a lot of modern magical practitioners and astrology, any kind of diviner, tarot cards, I don't care what it is, that has sort of caused, I think, a sense of diminished expectations of what we can expect from the occult in general. So, we might think that a flickering candle flame is way more than what it is. And I learned that from my leukemia world, because I've dealt with elders where it's just so ingrained. I mean, the minute they were born in that world, and that makes you look at the world a little bit differently. And so that when you're steeped in that magical worldview from birth, it's very different than adopting it when you're a kid or an adult, I think.
Yeah, that's something I think about quite a bit, is that sort of this worldview. And, it's often been said that, we live in a disenchanted world right now. And it's definitely one where the material takes precedence, and, even, atheism and whatnot, that, the matter is all there is. That's what's real. Magic and that kind of system is just nonsense. But, I've often wondered, and I know this is a little bit off of Agrippa, but,
or is it?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But how much of the workings of magic is, or maybe not the workings of magic, but the ideas of it not working, is part of that worldview? I mean, how much of our beliefs kind of make these things possible or deny their reality, if you understand what I'm...
Yeah, I think that belief is necessary. And, even, I can't remember if Agrippa says it. I know it says it in Picatrix, but you have to have belief in it. But that's true. That's true of anything in life. I mean, you can't become a famous basketball player if you don't believe in the game.
Right.
I don't mean it like Santa Claus, but you have to really believe that it's an important thing for you in order to do it. But I think that when magic is approached in a certain way, the belief becomes less important. Or it's a chicken and the egg argument, I guess. I think the metaphysical practitioner has had these, when they first started practicing, there was at least one wild success that happened.
Yeah.
And I've talked to some of my friends about this, and one of my friends has said that it's almost like the spirits give you this like crazy success, and that's probably that might be the best magician you're going to be for many years.
Yeah,
is right when you start, and then you spend all these years of a lot of failures, a lot of diminished success in some cases, peppered with a little bit of success. Because that's the time that you have to actually put everything together, and you're learning and that kind of a thing. But ultimately, belief is it's the it's the, I don't know, it's belief is something that carries you through the process, but I don't think it's what makes it work.
Right.
Because I mean, the old books when they talk about cursing, actually not even that old. We were talking about hoodoo even. When they curse people, they don't tell the other person they're cursing them.
Right.
This whole thing that they say today that cursing only works if you believe in it. Well, I mean, what happens if that person doesn't know about it?
Right.
There's no belief possible with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it seems to me that we're going through a kind of magical renaissance right now, it seems.
I agree.
And it may be a reaction against this disenchanted world. But it also, I think, has really sort of profound philosophical implications. I know that one of the things that Agrippa writes about is this, the world soul. And more and more I hear even, legitimate philosophers, and for those who are listening, I'm using air quotes there, as a reaction, they're actually starting to say, well, maybe there is something to this. Maybe there is something to consciousness being a fundamental feature of everything. And if that's the case, it seems to open the doors a little bit more to a magical worldview.
When you think about, Plato saying that that the universe is an animal, basically, and when I realized that, it sort of changed everything, because all of a sudden it's not that you are interacting with the universe, is that you are the universe. Right. You're part of it. But I think that about this resurgence, it's a lot of things going on. I mean, a lot of it has to do with media. I mean, really, this modern resurgence really happened in the 1800s. That's when it really started, and it went through a few fits and starts, but it really started picking up steam in the 60s. And so I think that with the cheap availability of media in general, that's what started during the Renaissance too. That was part of that too. Is this relative cheapness or inexpensive, I should say, cheap of books, and today it's, we can convey information for good and ill instantly with very little effort. And right now, I mean, we're especially seeing it in astrology. The primary medium of astrology seems to be, Twitter and TikTok. I don't love that, but it does get people interested, and the people who are serious are going to investigate. But yeah, it is a renaissance. I mean, what's happened simultaneously is the resurgence of, or the rediscovery of traditional astrology started in the 90s. And it took a long time for that to really take off. It really didn't start gathering steam until 15 years ago. But that's huge because for 100 years or so, most astrologers thought that astrology was what it was. They didn't really question anything about it as far as the general approach to it, what a sign was, what a planet was, and how you worked with those things. Suddenly we get these texts from ancient Greece, the Arab, most recently with Arabic material starting to come out. And it's changed everything. And now the occult world's kind of lagging behind that a little bit. They only started, I think seriously 20 years ago. And that's also starting to really ramp up now. Over the last 10 years, I think it's kind of coincides. And that's one of the funny things, I think, is how the history of astrology and the occult kind of have these mirror histories, despite the fact that most astrologers are not occultists, and most occultists are not astrologers. And a lot of astrologers don't even want to be called occult to begin with. So,
right. I'll tell you this: 2020 made me a true believer of the value or maybe the virtues of astrology.
COVID did it to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was funny. I did a natal chart reading. It was right at the beginning of the year before really the news was talking about COVID at all, or at least before I noticed it. And this woman asked me about her career, and I said, "Well, you're going to take a hit this year due to illness." And she's healthy, and she says, "What do you think it is?" And I said, "Well, it's due to illness." And I said, I don't know if it's you personally, but it's going to slow down because of that. And then, 2 months later, or whatever it was, that came out. She never got sick.
Okay.
So, but she was a coach, a life coach.
Okay.
So,
yeah. Well, she didn't need to get sick because illness still affected everything.
It did.
So you were absolutely right. Yeah. True believer after that one. So, I was looking at some definitions of magic, and I was drawing from, I think it's the Cambridge Handbook on Western Mysticism and Esotericism. And it had a whole list of different ways of looking at magic or defining magic. And two that I found particularly relevant for Agrippa was magic is ancient wisdom. And also this occult philosophy, which is what you identified as natural philosophy. And coming from a background in philosophy, the idea of natural philosophy is not foreign to me. My understanding is that natural philosophy really was trying to understand the nature, to understand the natural world. And at Agrippa's time, much of that was also trying to, I don't know if this is the correct word or not, but to kind of legitimize and maybe synthesize Plato and Aristotle.
Well, it's more than that. It's trying to not just reconcile the two of them together, but trying to reconcile the two of them with Christianity.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't see that much of as much of a conflict in the Arab world, in the Muslim world at that time.
Yeah.
It's almost like it got integrated easier somehow. I mean, you didn't really have these, like, I don't know, these persecutions or anything like that, like you did with the Christian world.
Yeah. My understanding is that within Islam, and this goes from the very beginning, is that there was an intelligence needed to look at or to read signs of God. And of course, the Quran was seen as the greatest sign, but early Muslims would look to the natural world and look at those as signs, as for the greatness of Allah. And most places that you find this in Christianity seems to be in the mystical traditions, that's sort of outside of the borders of the traditional practice or the traditional church.
Well, I think one of the differences is that at that time, Muslims saw themselves as inheritors of wisdom. They knew they weren't the first.
Right.
That was explicitly stated. But with Christianity, you have this issue with the word of the Bible being indelible. But around this time, I mean, I guess during the Renaissance, the Corpus Hermeticum was rediscovered. And I mean, the one Hermetic book that had already been out was Asclepius, but before that, the rest of the books weren't really known. And suddenly you have something that is as ancient as at least Moses. I mean, it could be before Moses as far as they're concerned. And they had to really think about that. I mean, so it's tough enough to explain Plato, but to explain something that's supposedly a precursor to Plato, although we now know that's not true. But
but this is all the context of where Agrippa was writing, and it was this rediscovery of Hermeticism, or at least the Corpus Hermetica, a kind of a Christianizing of Kabbalah, and this reintroduction of pagan philosophers. And but yet wasn't Agrippa, didn't he identify as Christian?
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah.
Not just Christian, but Catholic.
Okay. And so was he doing like Catholic magic?
Not the way we would think of it today. I mean, I think that if you say that today, people think that it's going to look like something like Santeria. Or what they do in Italy and Spain, where they do all this work with the saints. But Agrippa may have done that, but it's not in the book.
Right.
Agrippa, it's hard to pin down what Agrippa personally was doing, because there are a few places in the book where he says that I have done this or I have seen this, but generally it's hard to pin that down.
Yeah.
And so I kind of see him as kind of a typical academic at the time. He was doing astrology, but for medical purposes for the most part. Yeah. He may have done some planetary magic. He seems to have done some alchemy, but he doesn't really have this what do you call it, like I don't see him as this great mage,
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And it may have been a bit of an unfair question, because we do, especially in academics, like to put things into categories. And I don't know that the category separating religion and magic is very honest or all that helpful, because my understanding is that early on, even maybe as far back as when Agrippa was alive, identifying something as magical was often polemical on the behalf of the church leaders.
Right. One person's religion is another person's magic.
Right.
I think, I wouldn't say that they were the same thing. I think that, Agrippa's main, I would say, I guess one of his main points is that true magic requires religion. But I don't think that in his mind religion would require magic.
Okay.
Because really magic, I think it's in a lot of ways, I think magic is sort of what you do outside of the church. But according to Agrippa, so one of the problems during the Renaissance, let me back up. So one of the problems in the Renaissance is that with all of this, with the printing press becoming prevalent and all these new works coming into being, new works being translated, and as we were talking about earlier, all this reconciliation was happening. So it begged the question as to, okay, well, if magic exists, then what is good magic and what is bad magic? And it's not as easy to say, good magic is for nice things and bad magic is for bad things. Ficino wrote about it, Trithemius wrote about it, Johannes Reuchlin wrote about it, and in Agrippa's mind, these all introduced problems of some kind, but to I guess if we're painting with broad strokes, and especially in Agrippa's case, they would see good magic as being any kind of magic where you recognize God as the source of things. So as long as you keep God in the back of your mind, you're fine. But if you started believing in the primacy of nature and demons or anything else, that's when you start to get into trouble. It's funny because I see that argument come up a lot in. I think we all love our online occult groups on Facebook, but I see that kind of thinking a lot in the hoodoo groups, because they always have these things that will say, okay, well, I have this plant or this whatever. What is it good for? And the answer is that, it's sort of like in cooking. I use a lot of cooking analogies, I'm going to warn you. But it's sort of in cooking, sugar is great for sweetening things, but there are uses of sugar that aren't used in desserts, or things like you put in spaghetti sauce, but you don't eat the spaghetti sauce thinking that it's sweet. And it's that subtlety that gets missed a lot, because people have this modern scientific, again, way of looking at things where if you want, X, you have to do Y, and it's always going to be that. But when you read people like Agrippa, you start to realize that there's so much, ambiguity with it, which drives modern people crazy. But the since we haven't really answered the question of magic yet, that kind of comes into being, because the one variable that's always going to be there is the magician. And it's the unstated ingredient in all magical operations. And Agrippa in the second chapter is explicit on his definition. He doesn't really mention the magician quite as explicitly. Elsewhere he does, but that's the thing. I mean, if one magician can do the same, or say two magicians can do the same thing, and get wildly different results, because there's that variable. In leukemy, we call that force the ori, which is the part of you that connects with the divine, that symbolizes the crown of your head. Okay. And that's the ultimate authority, actually, in a lot of your operations, because that's all you can know, and that's all you can really interact with is yourself. So you can, again, you have two people doing the same thing, and you could approach that one thing in a million different ways and get a million different results. I'm not sure I diverted to that, but I did.
Yeah, that's okay. But let's kind of circle back to how Agrippa understands magic. Okay. Because my understanding, if I'm reading it right, actually I've got the direct quote here. I copied it out of your translation, that it is the most perfect and highest science, the highest and most sacred philosophy. It is the absolute consummation of the noblest philosophy, for all regulative philosophy is divided into natural science, mathematics, and theology. Mm-hmm. And so my understanding is that really magic is the last three: the natural science, math, and theology. But
it's a combination.
Yeah, there's still a bit more that's within all of those.
Right. Those are the simplest ways to state the three parts. Mm-hmm. The natural world's easy. I mean, that's everything you can see. Everything you can see and touch, I should say that. The mathematical world is a little bit more complex, because that includes astrology. It includes the proportions of the human body. It includes letters to some extent. Letters and numbers have a weird property in this thinking, because they straddle both the celestial mathematical world and the divine world, because they come from the mind of God, but they have this weird semi-physical but semi-not reality to them. And but the idea is that you have these three parts, and for true magic to work, you have to unite all those three parts. Again, with that unstated fourth part, which is the magician. So the example I often give is that, let's say you are performing a ceremony, and you have, let's say you have some kind of astrology involved, but you have no spirits involved whatsoever. That's more like theater. And you can have sacred theater that exists, or can exist. Doesn't exist so much now, but it can. But and theater is valid by itself, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's magic. And I think that's one of the really unfortunate things that's caused confusion over the last couple of centuries, is the degree that spirit's involved. And in some cases, it's not involved at all. It's become popular now, or I think less so over the last few years, that a lot of people think that it's just your mind. And while your mind is obviously going to be involved, that is not the source of the magic. And so if you don't have that spiritual part of it, then something's going to be missing. from the mix, even though it may work sometimes.
Yeah, that's actually one of the definitions that I found of magic is magic as psychology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also there's Crowley's famous definition,
right,
which I always disagreed with, because that's causing change in conformity with the will. I know that will is a complicated definition in the thelemic world, but it doesn't really explain what it really is, because causing change, that's everything in the world. You can't say that magic is everything, because then if magic is everything, then magic is nothing.
Right.
And really, according to Crowley's definition, it could be making toast. I suppose you could do magical toast, but it is magical sometimes.
Yeah.
But that causes so much confusion. It really opened up my vision of what astrology was, because again, the first impulse by a lot of people, including myself, is there's got to be a physical cause. It could be magnetism, it could be gravity, it could be vibrations, whatever. But going by with these traditional philosophies, it really opens up the possibilities of what you're working with. So are you actually dealing, when you work with the moon, is that a ball of rock that you're working with, or is it a spiritual component to that ball of rock that you're working with?
Would it be a combination of the two?
Well, that's up to the person. I personally, in a way, because astrology, the reason why astrology is predictive is because we use math and we can calculate the positions at any given time. So that position does seem to matter. Mm-hmm. I think if we're going to try to find a physical cause, right. I mean, why would the magnetism or vibration, or whatever, of the planet, the ball of gas, or is Venus of gas? I think Venus is rock.
Yeah, Venus is rock.
The ball of rock that is Venus, why would that cause love? And why would the ball of rock that is Mars cause a war? There's no reason why that should be from a scientific standpoint. Which, from a scientific standpoint, it's nothing.
Right. So, right. So you're working with the spirits of the planets, then? Is that
ultimately? Yeah.
Okay.
In my opinion.
Right.
And that there's a quote that I love. Unfortunately, I can't read the book because it's not translated. But the one quote from the book that is from the Encyclopedia of the Ikhwan al-Safa, which is in Arabic, and but it says something to the effect of, come brother to the temple of Hermes. They say something like, where they, the temple of the stars, that's what it is. To the temple of the stars, not the physical stars, but the stars of the philosophers. And there's Arabic material where they, like Al-Kindi is translated into English, where all it's about is how astrology works from a philosophical standpoint. And ultimately, really, magic and astrology are expressions of philosophy. They're not scientific acts. Modern science, traditional science, yes.
Right. Yeah, that's something I've been kind of exploring a little bit in terms of philosophy, and especially the ancient Greek philosophers, is that they're often presented as being just these rational beings, but yet that's not necessarily the case, especially, Plato. I think often people will say, okay, there was this mystical aspect of Plato, but there also was to the pre-Socratic philosophers. Mm-hmm. And I think it carried through many of the philosophers. And I always want to kind of investigate and ask, why is it that we rejected, why bury, why hide this other aspect of philosophy?
I think it was inevitable. I mean, it when you think about, sometimes I think about in the late traditional period, in England, with William. Do you know who William Lilly was?
I know the
astrologer.
Name,
yeah. He was. I mean, was one of the greatest astrologers, but he comes at the tail end of the traditional period, and later in his life there were these wars between him and Gadbury, who was another astrologer, and I think William Ramsay was another one. And there were these wars, and they were all calling each other charlatans, and there were some non-astrologers also making a lot of really vehement attacks against the astrologers. And so it's inevitable, I think, that when since our modern concept of reason was starting to sort of come into fruition, that it's obvious to kind of look at all of these mystical things going on as fraudulent. And I think it was just a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah.
And it didn't really have to be that way, because and I can't remember any names. I've read this sort of in passing, so forgive me. But there were scholars during the development of the modern scientific worldview that had more symbiotic definitions of reality that weren't quite so cut and dry. Materials good and non-materials bad. It's just one of those accidents of history that it just happened to work out the way that it did. So it didn't have to be that way. I think that there's I think over time there might be a little bit of a bending in some ways, but I don't see it really happening anytime soon. Yeah. I mean, because you have people like the other Tyson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who makes these ridiculous, remarks about astrology that, whether you believe in astrology or not is one thing, but he says things that astrologers don't even believe in, right, about astrology. And you can't win against those kinds of attacks. I mean,
right. Yeah. I think that from my perspective, my interest is to try to reclaim a more esoteric, mystical strand, because I see people really kind of craving that, and this acknowledgement that yes, rationality and reason is incredibly important, but so is the non-rational. I don't want to say the irrational, or I don't know about the language, but right. We need a combination of the both. You can't favor one over the other.
Yeah, I became accustomed to this with leukemia. Is the divination and that divinations that we do in leukemia are pretty hardcore, by compared to what a lot of modern Western magicians run into, and they can be pretty harsh. But really, the good diviners they'll tell. I've been told things like this myself, where they'll say things like, I see some things coming up about your heart. Go to the doctor. Like, they don't tell you to turn your brain off and say, you have problems with your heart, we're just going to do a bunch of magic, don't bother going to the doctor.
Right.
It should be both, because maybe you wouldn't think about going to the doctor.
Right.
And I've known people, not just one person, many people who've had experiences like that, where they're told that something is wrong, and not just to go to one doctor, go to 2, 3, 4 doctors. And eventually, one of those doctors is going to find the answer, and they may not have done that before. And that's kind of, I think, what you're talking about, is you're using metaphysical tools to find something that's very concrete. Honestly, that's what people have always done. I think. Yeah. I don't think it was like that. Granted, Agrippa would have had a different concept of what you do in medicine than we do today.
Right.
But it's always going to be, do what you need to do, but use your brain. I mean, you don't turn your brain off.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people like turning their brains off.
It's always been true too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
That's not modern.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know. So back to your translation of Agrippa, one of the things that you did is you tracked down and cross-referenced as many of the original sources as you could, what he was relying on, right? What can you tell us about these sources?
Well, one of the things that was a surprise to me is that I believe it was Tyson, alluded to the idea that Agrippa tracked down these now, forgotten missing, documents from, I don't know, some forgotten monastery somewhere. This is kind of a myth, that we've developed. In reality, Agrippa and Ficino and all these other people were using, the sources that were common back then. So that, almost everything Agrippa uses as a source is on either Google Books or on some university website. So I was able to find almost everything. There were a couple I couldn't find. Thanks to academia, at least I knew what they were. So I didn't have to start from scratch. But yeah, I was able to. I have a folder of about 200 books, PDFs that I was able to find. But yeah, they were common, and I don't think Agrippa necessarily had all the books. Like for instance, there's a lot of talk about Agrippa using Picatrix, for instance. And do you know Picatrix?
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Some people may not be.
But yeah. So that's what I was going to say is if you could give a explanation of Picatrix for anyone who may not be familiar.
So Picatrix was originally an Arabic text written, I believe, in the date's a little bit vague, but probably around the 11th century in Arabic originally. So it's sort of the main source on astrological magic. And it was eventually translated in the 13th century into Latin. That's the form that most people are familiar with. There are a couple of excellent translations of it around today. The Arabic version is going to be released any minute. I know that the translator's been working on it for a while, and she keeps saying that it's coming out soon. But there's been a lot of talk about Agrippa using Picatrix, and it wasn't that cut and dry. So for instance, like for the images of the decans, which are the 10-degree divisions of the zodiac, he mixes the material in Picatrix with at least one other book, and he kind of stacks up these definitions. So they're pretty big definitions, but it's a mixture of Picatrix and other books. And Agrippa didn't seem to really use some of the juicier tidbits about incense or astrological elections and that kind of thing. So it makes me believe that he had notes for Picatrix, and there weren't that many copies of it around either. But he had a lot. There's a lot of Ficino in there. There's a lot of Franciscus Zorzi, who was kind of a forgotten figure today. Reuchlin, and that's one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to show who the actual primary source was, and then in some cases who the secondary source is. So, for instance, when Agrippa quotes Plato, he's usually not quoting Plato directly. He's quoting Ficino, quoting Plato, or something like that.
And Ficino is the one who is translating Plato, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that's actually one of the fascinating things I did not know when I started, is that essentially the entire book is copy and pasted from other books, which there's a few layers that people always say, it's plagiarism. Back then, it was very common. That was one of the ways that you showed what you knew. But it's at the same time, to me, it's ingenious that he's taking quotes from whoever and then piecing them together to form a new argument, which is what he's doing. And he did this intentionally for me, for the reasons I already stated, but also because if he's saying that magic has been more accepted throughout history, he's putting those quotes in the book. So he's saying, okay, well, you shouldn't be criticizing me, you should be criticizing Augustine, because Augustine believed this, right, for instance. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And he was doing this at a time where it may not have been the safest time to write these things.
Definitely.
Because I think we still had inquisitions going on, and there were definitely women being accused of witchcraft. And my understanding is he actually defended a woman.
Successfully.
Yeah, successfully. I was curious about this, and then maybe you can shed light onto this. because I started thinking in terms of what he was doing with magic and writing about magic and how it was really part of a tradition versus the women who were getting accused of witchcraft, because it seems to me that there's a distinction to be made that has later been kind of muddied a little bit.
Well, also that narrative of the witch trials is a little bit, it's a little bit of a myth,
Yeah.
It definitely happened.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just women. I wish I could remember. Right. There's a pretty big percentage were men.
Right.
And there was an even bigger percentage, both male and female, that were Jewish.
Right.
So I think this kind of Wiccan myth of, the Christians trying to stamp down their religion, it's not really true. Yeah. Agrippa had powerful friends. That's why I think that's one of the reasons why he has those letters in the book. He was called, he was accused, I think, off the top of my head, 3 times, maybe 4 times.
Okay.
None of them were for 3 books.
Interesting.
They were for other books that he wrote. One was on the defense of women. Another time was, I think it was on his, the defense of women was for sure. I think some of it were from letters that he wrote. But in every case, all of these accusations were done. Accusations were done when Agrippa was not even in that city. They were done behind his back, so he couldn't defend himself. And in all those cases, he escaped punishment. The only time I know he was in jail was at the end of his life for debts.
Okay.
He basically knew the right people.
Okay.
So nothing really happened, but he was definitely on the radar constantly.
Right, for sure.
But he was also someone who tended to say the wrong things to the wrong people. I think he had a strong sense of justice, but I think he was kind of naive. We all know those people where maybe we are those people. I don't know, but where you have a truth that is correct, and you cannot understand why someone else doesn't have that or share that truth, and then you say it to them and they get pissed off at you.
Right.
And Agrippa just had that knack, I think.
Yeah.
That happened with the witch trial that you mentioned.
Right. Yeah. I'm still investigating the European witch trials, and I know that during the Crusades, the Jews suffered a brunt from the Crusaders.
Right.
I'm personally more familiar with what was going on in the United States, or the colonies, I should say, which was a different creature.
Yes.
Altogether, because my family was partly responsible.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Don't tell anybody.
Oh, I tell everybody. I'm here. Part of what I'm doing is making karmic amends for my ancestors.
There you go.
Yeah.
You'd really piss off your old great granddad.
Yeah, my cousin Cotton Mather.
Yeah.
So yeah, along these same lines, there's this idea, and you address this in your intro, I believe, that at one point Agrippa later in his life kind of rejected what he was doing with the 3 books of occult philosophy.
Supposedly.
Yeah, supposedly. And the way I was reading it, even his statement, it didn't seem like a rejection, but rather saying, I've corrected, I've revised what I was working on. Is that correct? Or
well, all of those, yeah. So the version we know as 3 books is a immensely revised version. It's and partially because Johannes Reuchlin published a book in between the 2 versions, which makes up a pretty good chunk of 3 books, but also Franciscus Zorzi published Harmonia Mundi, which is an immense book. It's bigger than 3 books. I've thought about translating it, but I don't think anybody wants to read it. It's very boring. It's a pretty tough book, but but it makes up a lot of 3 books. But this rejection. So the rejection that people are familiar with is from On the Vanities of the Sciences, that was published in the same group of books that 3 books was published in. I think it came out, I don't know, 4 years, 3, 4 years, 5 years, something like that before. And so it's important to understand that the purpose of that book was partially a satire. Not a satire as we would use the term today, but it was showing the folly of human learning, that people go through their day-to-day life thinking that we know so much, but at the end of the day, we really know little. The primary, I think, force of that book was that Agrippa wanted to make the distinction between knowledge and faith. And just like what I said about magic, is knowledge really is meaningless unless it's referring to God, that he was a true believer. And so he has all these little chapters showing how all these different, everything, but he has chapters on the different areas of occult learning that are basically pokes fun at it. And those chapters are reproduced in the JF translation at the end of 3 books. That's not part of 3 books. I didn't put those in there. I don't know why he put those in there, to be honest. But I don't believe it was a real rejection, because first of all, I think that when you think about the way that On the Vanity of Sciences was written, it's really written in the same sentiment that 3 books is written in, that you have to distinguish between good magic, bad magic. Vanity of the Sciences is, correct thinking and not correct thinking, basically. And so it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I think that he, on one hand, put that in there as a sort of a safety valve, but on the other hand, I don't think he really meant it, especially considering that he was probably revising 3 books as he was writing On the Vanity of the Sciences. So I don't think it was a true retraction. I think being a doctor, he couldn't truly disregard everything.
Okay.
Astrology, for instance, the humors,
yeah,
all those things.
Right. Why do you think we haven't had a new translation in over 350 years?
No idea. I think part of it, the comment that I get constantly is, why do we need a new one? Most people really have not read all of JF's translation or Tyson's version. I don't expect everybody to read my version either, if they buy it. I don't think they're going to, but I don't think they're going to. Most of the people who are going to buy my version, I don't think are going to read the whole thing. It's a tough book to get through. So I think if you just look at JF on the surface, or Tyson's version on the surface, it seems pretty comprehensive. And I think a lot of people don't realize that no matter how good or bad JF's translation is, there's always room for a new translation. So I don't think people realize that my translation is going to be superseded eventually, and it should be. But also, it's a tough book to translate. Right. So you have to spend that time. So at the same time, occultists are, by and large, are amateur academics. And I don't think that the idea of having to, I guess, treat these sources critically to that degree has really been taken seriously until recently. Right. I mean, Stephen Skinner's doing that. There's other people doing that today. That's pretty recent. Right. I know Skinner's been around for a while, but he's getting a lot more attention now. Right. So.
Yeah, I've noticed that myself, and it makes me wish I was about 25 years younger, so that when I was starting at school, I could actually do things that I was interested in, rather than being told, no, you don't need to do that.
Sometimes you have to get old to realize that most of that doesn't matter.
I know. So in the translations, we have the original Latin, right?
Right.
Okay. And so
several editions of it.
Okay. And that's what you were basing everything off of, the original Latin translations.
So what I did is I based it on the critical edition by Campagny, published by Brill. There are mistakes in there, some of which we didn't realize were there until not even the 11th hour. It was like the 11th hour, 59 minute of the publication. We found a bunch of things. But anyway, I did find a few mistakes early on. And so what I would do is I had 2 facsimile editions, PDFs. One was the first edition, one was the second edition. So was it 1533, and that one was like 1550 something, I think. And I just compared the two, especially the illustrations, but there were some words that kind of made it through. We found out at the last minute that the critical edition had incorrect Hebrew. I have a lot of anxiety about my book on that. I'm hoping that it came through okay. But everybody who's tried to revise Agrippa seems like they get it wrong. And the Hebrew is one of the best examples of that. So JF's Hebrew is different than the original. Tyson saw some errors and fixed that. And the critical edition tried to fix it, none of whom were like the original. And I've learned that that Agrippa was mostly correct. So
what prompted you to do this? I mean, it was such a decade-long endeavor.
How far back do you want me to go? A decade or further back?
Go back as far back as you want.
Okay, so when I started, in my leukemia world, I started very young, unintentionally. I wasn't looking for it, and which is a whole story. But I was looking for Crowley, and I found leukemia. But
can you say what leukemia is too, for anyone who might be familiar?
Most people know it as Santeria. It's the same thing. Most practitioners don't call it Santeria, but some do. It's it's an Afro-Cuban religion, primarily Yoruban from Nigeria. There are other cultures mixed into that. And it was, of course, brought to Cuba via slave trade. And it gets a little complicated because there's actually 3 major ethnic groups, or really 2 major ethnic groups primarily, that were in Cuba. The Congo were first, and they do Palo Mayombe. And the Yorubans primarily leukemia, but there's other people in there that are not Yoruban. But both the Congo and the Yoruban did a very good job of keeping your traditions alive. And they had to make some changes. And but by and large, it's kept pretty solid with some changes. And I came into it. It's a very complicated. I mean, I could do a whole podcast on it. I'd like to actually someday. But it's basically Afro-Cuban religion. That's initiatory and all that. And one's teacher is called a godparent. And so my godfather was also interested in Western esotericism his entire life. And so I was introduced to Agrippa through him, the Tyson edition. And yes, he told me about it, and he showed me what the book was and what it talked about. We went over some of the chapters together, and then eventually he passed away. And I decided to tackle a translation of Picatrix first, which was something else he introduced me to. And then I found out that Christopher Warnock and John Michael Greer were working on their translation, and I decided to stop. I wasn't far enough along for it to matter. And so I sat on it for a while, and I bought Agrippa just after he passed, after my godfather passed. And I started realizing that, hey, I saw a lot of, not exact, but conceptual parallels with what I'd learned through leukemia. But also I realized that the astrology was very different. than what I was used to. And it just opened up a whole rabbit hole. That's when I started studying traditional astrology and all that. After I was deep into traditional astrology, I started realizing that parts of Agrippa didn't make sense. And this was partially from conversations with Christopher Warnock, so I can't leave him out of this at all. And so I decided, okay, I'm just going to try, see what happens if I translate 5 chapters. And I immediately found problems. And I just stuck with it. With the first 5 chapters showed me the necessity of a new translation. That there were definitely errors in it, but it also showed me the necessity of showing the primary sources. Tyson was trying to do that. Again, this is not a dig on Tyson at all. I don't think he could have known most of these at that time. But what he was doing was, for instance, if Agrippa quoted Plato, he would put Plato in the footnotes with commentary. And there's a lot of like little digs in the Tyson edition as to like Agrippa being wrong here and Agrippa being wrong there. A lot of these are translation errors.
Right.
But so I realized that Agrippa has never really been shown for what he was actually saying in the book. And that sounds funny, but he's never really been represented well. And so my hope is that, I kept some of the commentary down to a minimum. There is some commentary, but I wanted to have as pristine a copy as possible for people to then argue with.
Right.
Because at least they can say, okay, well, I have this I can, work from.
I'm personally looking forward to getting my hands on copies. I think it's going to be my Christmas gift to myself this year.
I've been sending them out. I'm neck deep in them.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw one of the occult groups I belong to online, Susie Chang, posted a photograph that she had received her copies.
I didn't know she ordered it. Then I saw her posting it.
Yeah. Are they shipping them out already?
The publisher is Inner Traditions.
Okay.
And I also am shipping things out from my website. It's not as fast because I have to get them from Inner Traditions.
Okay.
But I get more money.
Okay.
But Amazon, I think Amazon and the booksellers are going to be, I think it got pushed back a couple of days. I want to say November 20th now, or 21st. Originally it was November 16th.
Okay.
But they're going out.
Yeah. Okay. Because I had the 23rd as the date that they were coming 23rd. Out. But I wasn't sure because they're, shipping issues right now.
I think that's why they did that, because I know that they were kind of biting their nails a little bit about getting the copies into the warehouse on time.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently they came in at the right time. And so I got my copies a couple of weeks ago.
Okay.
And, but early the pre-order people who did pre-orders had theirs for the most part.
All right. Yeah. I am going to try to read it all the way through. I know that you actually make that point that it ought to be read that way, rather than as, an encyclopedia where you can just like pick apart, or go directly to what you want, because it acts like a building block for everything that comes for, later.
Well, to use another food analogy, the example I always think of is, if you look at Julia Child's Mastering French Cooking book, she has a section on the mother sauces.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on you have a recipe for some totally different dish, and they'll say, okay, make a bechamel sauce. So there's no recipe for bechamel. And but you have to pick through it and find the bechamel. She's nice and has page numbers, but but the point is that she's not going to necessarily tell you in every single recipe, every single thing you have to make, because it's elsewhere in the book. And that's kind of what Agrippa did. It wasn't so much, in the last chapter, he says that he mixed up some of the material. It's I think there's a tendency for people to kind of make it like a Da Vinci Code sort of thing. You have to decode the book to get the true meaning of it. That's not what he was doing. It's just simply because he introduces, for instance, he introduces elements at the beginning of the book, but he talks about elements all throughout the book, right, in different ways that can't be contained in just that one chapter. So you will miss a lot of material if you just, thumb through the chapter headings.
Yeah. Well, so much is like that. I mean, one of the classes I teach is logic, and logic, it builds, and you'll hear the same language later on, but if you don't have that initial building block, you're going to miss a lot.
It's really like modern science books in general.
Yeah.
Because, it's sort of like having, if you're to have all of science in one book, which you can't, it's sort of like having, the beginning, you talk about atoms. And then you talk about the combinations of atoms, molecules, and then you kind of build off of that. That's kind of what he's doing.
So just a couple more questions before I let you get on with your day. I know that there are people like myself and, like Susie Chang, and I can think of a few others who are really looking forward to reading your new translation. But just in general, why should people read Agrippa now?
Because I think that philosophy is something that's missing by and large in modern magic and astrology. And I said earlier that magic and astrology are really expressions of philosophy, which is to say there's no one answer.
Okay.
It's sort of like saying, what is philosophy, right?
Yeah.
What does philosophy believe in?
Nothing.
Nothing. But because right now we're living in a sort of we're in a sort of disjointed stage in our history. If you're interested in magic and the occult in general, metaphysics, like I said earlier, we don't live in that world today, that believes that those things actually exist or work. And there's a point in your life, if you're serious about it, that you have to be able to internalize what those things are for you. Each person's probably going to be different. And that process starts by asking the right questions, not necessarily by getting the right answers. And that's why I think Agrippa is important, because I don't agree with Agrippa on everything. But it got me to create this sort of inner dialogue of, what does this actually mean? If we're doing astrology, what is it actually doing? If we're doing magic, what does it actually mean? And, I have the answers that I formulated that it will change over time. Agrippa's probably changed a little bit over his lifetime. Well, he did, actually, because he wrote 2 versions of the book. But we don't have that today. The people who read that book in the 16th century had to have been educated, which meant they knew their Plato, they knew their Aristotle. And, today people just don't. I don't think you have to know Plato and Aristotle to do magic and astrology, but again, they had that philosophical grounding. And I don't know, it's a sorely missing area. And I think it causes, again, there are favorite online groups, just these really inane approaches.
Right. Yeah.
Sad.
Yeah, I like returning Agrippa to a place in the intellectual history of the world, because it seems to me that there's always things of value to be found in that which has been discarded.
Yeah, and Agrippa is, it's an unfortunate thing that he's only known for 3 books,
right?
Because he was a great thinker of his time. And, kind of a proto-feminist, not in our modern sense of the word, for sure.
Right.
But, baby steps and all that. But today we just think of him as a Faustian, character. He was actually, he's an intellectual.
Yeah. And I think at some point I think this came from you, that you said that he was a mainstream scholar of his day.
Right.
It wasn't anything obscure. He was just doing what others were doing.
Right. Except, what's unique with him is that, he frankly did a better job than, especially Ficino, I think, of formulating this whole cohesive worldview. And that's the amazing thing of 3 books. That's why I think it's stuck around so long, is because there's really no book like that before or since. Right. No one's tried to do that since Agrippa that I'm aware of. And to come with the theory of the world, from a magical standpoint, I'd be afraid to do it myself.
Right.
But Ficino had holes, and it's partially not Ficino's fault. Probably it's because Agrippa benefited from standing on the shoulders of giants himself, and he was able to take what they learned and build something from that. But no one's done that to Agrippa.
Right.
It's frankly amazing, and I can't imagine trying to do that.
Right.
Especially with that kind of confidence.
Yeah. So, last 2 questions. Number 1, what are you going to work on next?
As any other undiagnosed ADHD person, I'm not sure. I have a few things in process. I've always had 3 or 4 books in process.
Okay.
I have a tendency of choosing the hardest thing possible. So one long-term project is a translation of a very large astrology book that's never been fully translated. That's physically larger than 3 books. So of course it's going to be another 11 years. But I want to write a book on leukemy.
Okay.
There aren't too many beginners books out there, especially for non-Spanish speaking people. So I've been thinking of that, and that's actually a relatively easy book, and maybe a book on beginner's book on traditional astrology.
Okay. So. All right. Are you taking a break though? Have you had a break since
sort of
publication of?
Kind of.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in the transcription stage of that astrology book.
Okay.
And that's my zone out. I have a movie on type of activity.
Okay.
I'm 400 pages into it.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the last question then is, where can people find out more about you and your website where they can order your book? Books, I should say.
Well, I wrote right now a book.
Yeah.
Well, my website's ericpurdue.com. It's very hard to remember. I have a blog there. I haven't really updated it in a long time. So, but I have my astrology readings on there, and of course the book. And other than that, I'm on Facebook, posting a lot of pictures of cats and memes, and occasionally profound things.
All right. Yeah. Well, that's a rarity for Facebook.
I know, but we all like cats.
Yeah, we do. I have one sitting on me right now. So, okay. Well, Eric, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking this out of your day to speak with me.
Well, it's my pleasure.
And again, I am very much looking forward to getting my hands on your translation of Agrippa.
What somebody called that their wisdom chunk.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of wisdom chunks I need to get through, but that's one that I definitely want to. I'm trying to do this sort of historical study, I think, of our Western esoteric traditions. I started taking a deep dive a couple of years ago. And,
he's a good person because I put a bibliography in it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and all the books are available. I mean, you may have to translate it from Latin in some cases, but everything's out there.
Yeah, that's beyond that's beyond my ability. Maybe a little bit of Sanskrit, but yeah, I don't do the Latin.
You got me on the Sanskrit.
Yeah. All right. Well, Eric, thank you again. I
thank you.
Very grateful. All right.
And that's a wrap on episode 20 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you are part of my YouTube audience. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive rating on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. It only takes a second, and your 5-star rating really does help. If you have a minute to spare, consider sharing a positive review. And please consider subscribing. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be informed when I upload new content.
I've been releasing episodes weekly and would like to continue doing so. I'm also working on creating additional video content for the YouTube channel, including book reviews, educational videos on topics concerning spirituality, the history of religion, and the religious response to the climate crisis. But that extra content takes a lot of time and a lot of work. If you would like to support me in creating free and credible material on YouTube and continuing with this podcast, please consider making a one-time donation via PayPal. You can find a link for that in the video description or show notes. Your support makes this podcast possible. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.